Welcome to the I Choose Today podcast. I am so glad you're here. Last week, we started a new mini-series on perseverance, and we talked about what it looks like to keep walking, even when life feels uncertain. Today, I wanted to talk to you about something closely connected to perseverance, and that is waiting. Because if we're honest, perseverance often shows up most clearly in the seasons of waiting. Waiting for answers, waiting for direction, waiting for healing, waiting for change. Waiting can feel uncomfortable, can it? I think one of the hardest parts about waiting is that we live in a world that values speed. We want quick answers, quick results, quick clarity. But God often works slowly, and that tension can be difficult. Because while everything around us says, move faster, God sometimes says, wait. And waiting feels like we're falling behind, like everyone else is moving forward while we're standing still. But waiting isn't falling behind. Waiting is often where God is aligning us with His timing. Because God is not in a rush. He is intentional. And sometimes what feels like delay is actually preparation. And perseverance in the waiting means trusting that God's timing is better than our own. Because let's face it, we like movement. We like clarity. We like knowing what's next. But waiting feels like standing still. And sometimes waiting can even feel like God is silent. But Scripture paints a very different picture of waiting. Waiting is not inactivity. Waiting is not abandonment. Waiting is often where God does some of His deepest work in us. Isaiah talks about those who wait on the Lord gaining renewed strength. Not because waiting is easy, but because waiting teaches us to depend on Him. And I think that's one of the hardest parts about waiting. It requires trust. It requires surrender. It requires us to release control. And if I'm being honest, that's not always easy. Because when we're waiting, we don't always see what God is doing. We don't always see progress. We don't always understand His timing. But waiting doesn't mean God isn't working. Sometimes waiting is where God is preparing us. Sometimes waiting is where God is strengthening us. And sometimes waiting is where God is shaping our hearts. And perseverance in the waiting means choosing to trust, even when we don't see. Psalms 27:14 talks about waiting on the Lord and taking courage. Wait patiently for the Lord. Be brave and courageous. Yes, wait patiently for the Lord. I love that connection between waiting and courage. Because waiting takes courage. It takes courage to trust God's timing. It takes courage to keep believing when nothing seems to be changing. It takes courage to keep walking forward when you don't have clarity. And I think sometimes we assume perseverance only looks like pushing forward. But sometimes perseverance looks like standing still and trusting. That's a different kind of perseverance. It's quiet. It's steady. It's anchored. And I think about how many people in Scripture experience seasons of waiting. Abraham waited for years for the promise of a son. Joseph waited in prison. David waited before becoming king. Even Jesus waited. There were 30 years of quiet before his public ministry began. But you see, the waiting is not wasted. Waiting is a part of the journey. And sometimes perseverance means trusting God in the waiting. Romans 5:3 talks about how suffering produces perseverance. Perseverance produces character, and character produces hope. There's that progression again. Waiting develops perseverance. Perseverance shapes our character. And over time, hope grows. And I love how another translation puts this. It talks about how troubles develop what is called passionate patience, and how that patience forges something like tempered steel in us, keeping us alert for whatever God will do next. I just love that imagery, because steel isn't formed easily. It's forged through heat, through pressure, through time. And in the same way, perseverance is forged in us through seasons of waiting. Not because God is trying to make things hard for us, but because He's forming something stronger in us. He's forming a steadiness, a resilience, and a stronger faith that isn't easily shaken. And that kind of strength doesn't develop overnight. It's forged, one season at a time. Because as we wait, we begin to see that God is faithful. And I think waiting does something else too. Waiting reveals where we place our trust. Because when we're waiting, we don't have control. We can't force outcomes. We can't rush the process. And we certainly can't create clarity. And in those moments, we're invited to trust God more deeply. Waiting strips away our illusion of control and draws us closer to Him. And I think that's why waiting can be so transformative. Because when everything slows down, we learn to depend on Him in a deeper way. We learn to trust Him, not just for answers, but for presence. And sometimes that's the deeper work God is doing in the waiting. Not just preparing what's ahead, but preparing our hearts. We begin to see that He is working even when we don't see it, and that builds hope. I think one of the hardest parts of waiting is that we don't know how long it will last. If we knew the timeline, waiting might feel easier. But faith often means trusting without knowing. And that's where perseverance comes in. It's continuing to trust God one day at a time. It's continuing to believe even when answers don't come right away. It's continuing to rest in Him even when things feel uncertain. And sometimes waiting is not passive. Sometimes waiting looks like praying, trusting, surrendering, staying faithful. Waiting is not doing nothing. Waiting is actively trusting God. And I think sometimes we feel pressure to rush ahead, to figure things out, to create movement. But sometimes God just calls us to wait. And perseverance means trusting Him even in that place. I've had seasons in my life where I didn't know what God was doing, where I was waiting for direction, where I was unsure what the next step looked like. Those seasons weren't always comfortable. But looking back, I can see that God was working. He was preparing. He was shaping. He was strengthening my faith. And sometimes we don't see what God is doing until later. But perseverance in the waiting means trusting that He is working even now. Because like I said before, waiting is not wasted. God is working in the waiting. And if you find yourself in a season of waiting right now, I want to encourage you. You're not stuck. You're not forgotten. God is working even when you don't see it. And perseverance in the waiting, it just means choosing to trust Him one day at a time. If you're in a waiting season right now, take a moment today and surrender that waiting to God. Tell Him you are trusting His timing. Tell Him you trust His plan. And then take one step of faith, even in the waiting. Because perseverance sometimes looks like moving forward. And sometimes perseverance looks like trusting God while you wait. Thanks for joining me today. And remember, you can always choose today.